It all began subtly enough, with Katharina saying she'd found a new job. It was supposed to be a part-time gig with night shifts, she explained casually one evening. I remember thinking how unusual it was for her to suddenly take up a position that required her to work so late. It wasn't like Katharina to pursue something so out of her comfort zone, especially with her aversion to anything that disrupted our routine. At first, I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably just another opportunity she'd come across. One she was excited about. But then things started to change. Katharina's once warm and open demeanor grew distant. She started coming home later and later, and when she was home, she seemed preoccupied, her thoughts elsewhere. She'd slip into the bedroom, shower quickly, and barely speak before collapsing into bed. It was like she was there, but not truly present. As the weeks passed, her absences became more pronounced. She'd say she was working late or that her boss needed her to stay longer. Whenever I asked her about the details of her job, she'd respond with vague answers, brushing off my questions as if they were unimportant. Her once open and friendly nature was replaced with a tight-lipped reserve. I noticed other changes, too. There were new items around the house, expensive-looking accessories, and a designer handbag. Katharina couldn't explain where they came from, and whenever I brought it up, her explanations were disjointed and hurried. She'd shift the topic to something else, laughing off my concerns as if they were mere figments of my imagination. One evening, after another late-night absence, I sat in our living room, the silence heavy with my thoughts. It struck me just how isolated I felt. Katharina was physically present, but emotionally and mentally she seemed to be somewhere else entirely. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. In those quiet moments alone, doubts gnawed at me. Was this job really what it seemed? Was there something she wasn't telling me? The more I observed her behavior, the more I felt a growing unease. It was as if an invisible wall had been erected between us, and every night she walked through it, leaving me on the other side. This growing distance was the beginning of a troubling realization. I couldn't ignore the changes any longer. The more she withdrew, the more I found myself on the outside looking in, and it left me questioning what was happening in the life of the woman I thought I knew so well. It started with small things, a necklace, a pair of designer sunglasses. I noticed them around the house, each item more extravagant than the last. At first, I thought maybe Katharina had simply bought them for herself, a little treat to brighten her long nights. But as the weeks went by, the gifts began to pile up. One evening, she came home with a shiny new bracelet that sparkled in the light as she placed it on the counter. I raised an eyebrow, trying to sound casual as I asked, "That's a beautiful bracelet. Did you get it for yourself?" Katharina's face brightened with a forced smile. "Oh, it's nothing special. I just saw it and thought it would be nice to have." "Where did you get it?" I asked, unable to hide my curiosity. She hesitated for a moment before shrugging. "Just a little boutique near the office. They were having a sale." The explanation didn't sit right with me. The boutique she mentioned was a small, unremarkable shop on the outskirts of town, nowhere near the upscale jewelry I was seeing. I tried to let it go, but the nagging feeling of unease lingered. A few days later, Katharina came home with a luxurious leather handbag. It was expensive, the kind of thing you'd see in a high-end store, not something you'd find on sale. I asked again, trying to hide my frustration, "Another new purchase? Where did this one come from?" Katharina's response was a strained laugh. "Oh, it was a gift from a friend at work. She was cleaning out her closet and thought I might like it." Her answers were beginning to feel like a rehearsed script. I tried to press further. But every time I did, her responses grew more evasive. She would change the subject or laugh it off, and each attempt to get a straight answer only deepened the confusion. One night, after she had gone to bed, I found myself staring at the gifts she had left behind. The pile was growing, and so was my sense of unease. I couldn't help but wonder where she was getting all this money. Her salary from her supposed night job didn't add up to the luxury items she was bringing home. The more I observed, the more it became clear that something was amiss. Katharina's explanations seemed flimsy and her behavior increasingly suspicious. Each gift seemed to be a small piece of a puzzle I couldn't yet solve, but the picture they painted was far from comforting. As I watched her drift off to sleep beside me, I knew that these unspoken gifts were more than just material things. They were a sign of a deeper problem I was desperate to understand. The more Katharina's late-night absences became routine, the more my suspicions grew. It wasn't just the gifts that bothered me, it was the whole situation. Her vague explanations and increasingly odd behavior were adding up to a picture I didn't like. One night, as I lay awake in bed, I decided that enough was enough. I needed to understand what was happening during those late hours when she was supposedly at work. I waited until she left for her shift, and then, with a mix of determination and trepidation, I followed her. I watched her drive off into the night, her car's taillights disappearing into the darkness. I trailed behind at a safe distance, trying to stay out of sight. My heart pounded with a mixture of fear and anticipation as I followed her through the quiet streets of our neighborhood. She drove to a part of town I wasn't familiar with, an area that had a reputation for being less than savory. Weaving through side streets, she finally pulled into a dimly lit parking lot behind a nondescript building. I parked a short distance away, observing as she got out of the car and walked toward the entrance of the building. The place looked abandoned, with flickering neon signs and dirty windows. I could barely make out the name of the establishment, Club Neon. It wasn't the sort of place one would associate with a reputable job. I waited until Katharina entered before approaching the building cautiously. Peering through a crack in the door, I could see a few dim lights and hear the faint murmur of conversation. It wasn't a bustling nightclub or a respectable business. It was something different, something that made my stomach churn. After a few moments of indecision, I decided to drive around the building, trying to find another entrance or additional clues. I noticed a small alleyway on the side and parked there, hoping to catch a glimpse of what was happening inside. Katharina emerged a couple of hours later, looking flustered and somewhat disheveled. She hurried to her car, glancing around nervously before getting in and driving away. My heart raced as I watched her leave. I had seen enough to know that this place was far from ordinary. I returned home, my mind racing with the implications of what I had seen. It was clear now that Katharina's night job was something far more troubling than I had imagined. I felt a mixture of anger and betrayal. I knew I couldn't ignore these signs any longer. The trust I had in her was eroding rapidly, and I needed to confront the reality of the situation before it consumed me entirely. That night, as I lay in bed, the darkness felt heavier than ever. The shadow of suspicion loomed over me, and I knew that I had to confront Katharina with what I had discovered. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the lies and evasions had reached their breaking point. I spent the following day replaying the scenes from the previous night, trying to make sense of everything I had seen. The nagging feeling in my gut told me I needed more than just suspicion. I needed concrete evidence. I decided to search through Katharina's belongings while she was out, hoping to find something that would confirm my fears. As I carefully went through her things, I found her phone left on the kitchen counter. It was unlocked, a small oversight on her part that might reveal more than she intended. My hands trembled slightly as I picked it up, knowing that what I might find could change everything. Scrolling through her messages, I saw a string of conversations that made my stomach turn. There were numerous texts from various numbers, all marked with timestamps late into the night. The messages were explicit and transactional, discussing prices and rendezvous details. I felt a surge of nausea as I read through them, realizing that Katharina had been engaging in activities far from what she had claimed. I found one message in particular that stood out, a conversation between Katharina and someone identified as Client 8. It outlined a meeting at a specific location, with precise details about what was expected and the payment involved. The casual, businesslike tone of the messages was chilling. It was clear that Katharina had been leading a double life, one that revolved around illicit transactions. As I continued to dig through her phone, I stumbled upon photos and addresses. Some of them were taken to the same places I had seen her visiting. There were images of her in various outfits that were meant to attract clients and receipts for services rendered. I took screenshots of the incriminating messages and saved them for later, knowing I would need undeniable proof when I confronted her. The weight of the evidence was overwhelming, and with each discovery, the reality of Katharina's situation became more horrifyingly clear. The final blow came when I found a calendar app with scheduled appointments. Each entry was marked with a different client's name and the location of their meeting. It was a methodical and organized plan, a stark contrast to the disarray I had expected from someone in her position. Feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and betrayal, I realized that my worst fears had been confirmed. Katharina's late-night shifts were not about a new job, they were about something far more damaging and secretive. The woman I had shared my life with was living a dangerous and hidden existence. I knew I had to confront her, but I also understood that the conversation would be anything but easy. The discovery had shattered the trust between us, and the path forward seemed unclear. As I put the phone back where I found it, I felt a profound sense of loss. The life I thought I knew was unraveling before my eyes. And I was left to grapple with the painful truth of Katharina's secret life. Catherine A. began to withdraw into herself more and more. She avoided social gatherings, declined invitations, and started making excuses whenever our friends wanted to meet up. I noticed the concerned looks and whispered questions from our circle of friends, who had begun to notice the strange changes in her behavior. One evening, while trying to divert my thoughts from the pain, I met up with a few close friends at a local bar. They were quick to sense that something was off. "James, you've been quiet lately," said Mark, a longtime friend who had always been perceptive. "And Katharina, she's not herself. What's going on?" I hesitated, unsure how to respond. The last thing I wanted was to divulge the intimate details of our struggle. "It's been a rough patch," I said, trying to sound casual. "Katharina's been dealing with some personal issues, and it's been hard on both of us." Linda, another close friend, leaned in with concern etched on her face. "We've noticed. She's been avoiding us, canceling plans at the last minute. It's not like her. Is she okay?" I forced a smile, though it felt forced and hollow. "She's just been overwhelmed lately. I'm sure she'll open up when she's ready." The conversation shifted, but the questions lingered in my mind. It was clear that our friends were noticing the distance and the sudden change in Katharina's behavior. They were worried, but there was little I could share without revealing more than I was ready to. I didn't want to burden them with the details of our issues, but I also didn't want to lie. As I left the bar, I felt the weight of their concern. It was clear that Katharina's behavior had not gone unnoticed, and our social circle was becoming increasingly aware of the strain in our relationship. Her isolation from them was adding another layer of complexity to an already painful situation. Back at home, Katharina continued to avoid social interactions, choosing instead to stay in her room or spend time alone. The once vibrant and engaging woman had become a shadow of her former self, and it was evident that she was struggling with her guilt and shame. I tried to bridge the gap, reaching out to her, but she remained distant and withdrawn. Our conversations were strained, and she would often cut them short, retreating into her solitude. The growing distance between us was palpable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that our friends were catching only glimpses of the disarray in our lives. The more Katharina withdrew, the more I felt the isolation closing in. Our friends were concerned, but they were kept at arm's length by Katharina's avoidance. It was a difficult position to be in, caught between the desire to protect her privacy and the need to address the growing questions from those around us. As I lay awake that night, the silence of the house was almost deafening. The distance between us seemed to stretch infinitely, and the once close-knit circle of friends now felt like a distant echo of what used to be. The path forward was unclear, and I was left grappling with the fallout of Katharina's choices and the growing chasm between us and the world we once knew. The house was shrouded in a heavy silence as Katharina walked through the door that evening. I was pacing, my mind racing with the truth I had uncovered and the emotional weight of what was to come. I had spent the day gathering my thoughts, preparing for the inevitable confrontation. Katharina looked up at me with a weary expression, as if she could sense the gravity of the moment. "James, is everything okay? You've been on edge all day." I took a deep breath, feeling the tight knot of tension in my chest. "We need to talk. I've seen the messages, the photos, everything. I know about the work you've been doing." Her face paled as she realized the depth of my knowledge. She sat down heavily on the edge of the couch, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and resignation. "James, I didn't think you'd find out like this. I'm so sorry." I sat opposite her, the evidence of her double life still fresh in my mind. "How could you keep this from me? Why did you think this was the only way?" Katharina's voice trembled as she began to speak, her eyes downcast. "James, you need to know everything. It wasn't just about the debts. I got involved in something much worse. I started gambling." The word hung in the air, heavy and ominous. My heart sank. "Gambling?" I had no idea. "Why did you keep this from me? Why didn't you tell me the truth?" Katharina wiped her tears, struggling to maintain her composure. "It started with just a little, playing a few games online, hoping to win some money to cover a bill or two. I thought I could control it, that it wouldn't get out of hand. But it did. It got so much worse." I leaned forward, trying to process her words. "How did it escalate so quickly? Why didn't you seek help?" She took a deep breath, her voice breaking. "The losses started to pile up. Each time I lost, I thought I could win it back with one more bet. I convinced myself that it was just a matter of time before I'd hit a big win and turn everything around. But the more I lost, the more desperate I became." Her hands fidgeted in her lap as she continued. "I began borrowing money from friends and family, trying to cover my losses and stay in control. But the debts kept growing. I couldn't stop. The addiction took over, and I was so ashamed. I didn't want anyone to know how deep I was in. I kept thinking I could fix it before it got too serious." My mind reeled with the implications of her admission. "So you turned to prostitution as a way to get out of the financial hole? You saw that as the only option?" Katharina's sobs grew more intense, her voice barely audible. "I didn't see another way. I was desperate and out of options. I thought if I could just get enough money quickly, I could pay off the debts and then stop everything. I never meant for it to go this far." The room seemed to close in around me, the enormity of her actions hitting me with full force. "How could you let it get so bad? Why didn't you come to me sooner? We could have found a way to deal with this together." "I was afraid," she admitted, her voice choked with emotion. "I was embarrassed and didn't want to admit how bad things had gotten. I thought I could handle it on my own, that I could fix things before you found out. But the deeper I got, the harder it was to stop. I kept thinking I could turn it around, but I was wrong." Her words were punctuated by her heavy breathing, the weight of her regret clear in every syllable. "I never wanted to hurt you. I thought I was protecting you by keeping it a secret. I thought I could fix everything without involving you." I sat there, feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and betrayal. "Do you understand what this means for us? It's not just about the money or the gambling. It's about trust, about how your choices have affected us." Katharina nodded, her tears falling freely now. "I understand. I know I've broken your trust. And I'm so sorry for that. I never meant for things to end up like this. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make amends. I'll stop everything immediately. I'll seek help for my gambling addiction and work to pay off the debts honestly." Her pleas were sincere, but they were overshadowed by the pain of her betrayal. "I need time to process all of this. The trust between us has been severely damaged. I need to figure out if and how we can move forward." "I understand," Katharina said, her voice filled with a mix of hope and despair. I'll wait for as long as it takes. I just hope you can find it in your heart to give me a chance to show that I can change and make things right." As she sat there, her face etched with remorse, I felt a deep sense of uncertainty about our future. The road to rebuilding trust was fraught with challenges, and the impact of her choices had created a chasm between us. The path ahead was clouded with doubt and the struggle to reconcile the woman I thought I knew with the harsh reality of her actions. The evening wore on, the silence between us filled with the weight of unspoken thoughts and unresolved feelings. Katharina's attempts to explain her desperation and the choices she made were heartfelt, but they did little to erase the hurt and betrayal I felt. The journey to repair what had been broken would be long and painful, filled with difficult decisions and the challenge of finding a way forward amid shattered trust. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from the table lamp that cast long shadows on the walls. Katharina sat across from me, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes filled with a mixture of desperation and hope. The weight of our earlier conversation hung heavily between us, and the silence was almost unbearable. I sat and thought, how could Katharina do this after 6 years of our marriage? "I know I've hurt you deeply," Katharina began, her voice quivering. "I'm so sorry for everything. I never wanted any of this to happen. I realize now how wrong I was and how much damage I've done." She took a deep breath, her voice breaking as she continued. "I didn't know how to stop. I thought I could handle it, that I could fix my problems on my own. But I see now how foolish I was. I'm asking for your forgiveness, and I'm begging for your help." Her eyes were filled with tears, and her hands trembled as she spoke. "I promise you, James, I'll stop everything immediately. I'll quit prostitution and get help for my gambling addiction. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." I could see the pain and regret in her eyes, but it did little to ease the ache in my heart. "How can I be sure this isn't just a temporary promise? How can I trust that you'll follow through on your commitments?" Katharina's tears flowed freely now, and she reached out to me, her voice choked with emotion. "I know I've broken your trust. I understand if you're angry and hurt. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove that I can change. I'll seek professional help for my gambling addiction and work to pay off the debts honestly. I'll be open with you about everything from now on. I just need a chance to make things right." Her words were heartfelt, but the road to forgiveness felt daunting. "What kind of help are you planning to get? How will you ensure that you stick to your promises?" "I've already reached out to a counselor who specializes in gambling addiction," she said, her voice steadier now. "I'm also looking into support groups and financial counseling to help manage the debts. I know it won't be easy. And it won't happen overnight, but I'm committed to making changes." I nodded slowly, trying to process her commitment. "I want to believe that you can change, that you can make things right. But rebuilding trust will take time. I need to see that you're truly committed to this, that you're taking the necessary steps to address your problems." Katharina's face was a mixture of relief and anxiety. "I understand. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to show you that I'm serious about changing. I know I've made a terrible mistake, but I hope that with time and effort, we can find a way to heal." The sincerity in her voice was evident, but the road ahead was uncertain. I wanted to support her, to believe in her ability to change, but the pain of her betrayal was still fresh. "I need to think about this, Katharina. I need to figure out what's best for us moving forward." Katharina nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and resignation. "I understand. I'll give you all the time you need. I'm just grateful for the chance to make things right. I hope you can eventually forgive me." As she sat there, her face a portrait of remorse and determination, I felt the weight of the decision before me. The path to rebuilding our relationship would be long and fraught with challenges, but her plea for help and commitment to change provided a glimmer of hope. The future was uncertain, but the journey to repair what had been broken had to begin with a sincere effort to address the issues and rebuild the trust that had been shattered. The days following Katharina's confession were filled with a haze of disbelief and raw emotion. Each day seemed to drag on, the weight of her actions pressing down on me with a suffocating force. The house, once a sanctuary of comfort and familiarity, now felt like a prison of broken trust and shattered dreams. I spent countless hours lost in thought, grappling with the reality of what I had learned. The revelation that Katharina had engaged in such dangerous and demeaning activities was a crushing blow. The shock of discovering her involvement in prostitution, compounded by her gambling addiction, left me reeling. I felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under me, leaving me to flail in a void of confusion and heartache. Every time I tried to process my emotions, a wave of anger and betrayal would wash over me. It was hard to reconcile the woman I loved with the person who had made such desperate and damaging choices. I had always known her as someone strong and compassionate. But now I was forced to confront the fact that she had hidden a dark side of her life from me. The shock was palpable, an ever-present shadow that loomed over every moment. I found myself staring at the walls, struggling to focus on mundane tasks, my mind constantly drifting back to her admission. The thought of her participating in such risky and degrading activities made me feel sick to my stomach. I couldn't escape the images that played out in my mind, each one a painful reminder of the betrayal. I spent evenings pacing the living room, wrestling with my thoughts. The trust we had built over the years felt like it had been demolished in an instant. Each time I saw Katharina, her face etched with regret and desperation, I was reminded of the chasm that had opened between us. Her pleas for forgiveness and promises of change were drowned out by the overwhelming sense of betrayal. One night, after another sleepless evening spent turning over my feelings, I found myself sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at the space beside me. The bed that once symbolized comfort and companionship now seemed like a reminder of what had been lost. The intimacy we shared felt like a distant memory, replaced by the harsh reality of her actions. I struggled to find the right words to express my feelings, but they seemed inadequate. The emotional turmoil was too complex to articulate easily. I was angry, yes, but I was also profoundly hurt. The trust that had once been the foundation of our relationship now felt irrevocably damaged. The person I thought I knew so well had become a stranger in my eyes. As days turned into weeks, I found myself caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. I wanted to support Katharina and believe in her ability to change, but the pain of her betrayal was too fresh. I was caught between my love for her and the overwhelming sense of being deceived. The future seemed uncertain, and the path to healing felt obscured by the fog of my emotions. The journey ahead was fraught with challenges. I knew that if we were to move forward, it would require a tremendous amount of effort, honesty, and time. Katharina's willingness to seek help and make amends was a step in the right direction, but rebuilding trust was not something that could be achieved overnight. The emotional scars would take time to heal, and the process would be anything but easy. As I faced the emotional crisis that had overtaken my life, I had to confront the reality of our situation and find a way to navigate through the pain. It was a journey of self-discovery and healing, one that would test the limits of my resilience and my capacity to forgive. The days after Katharina's confession felt like an endless cycle of tension and unresolved emotions. Despite her earnest attempts to turn her life around, her efforts seemed to fall short in my eyes. I watched as she tried to make amends, applying for new jobs and attending counseling sessions, but it all felt like a facade to me. The depth of my hurt and betrayal overshadowed any signs of progress she tried to make. Katharina's efforts were evident in her actions. She spent hours scouring job listings, attending interviews, and making appointments with a therapist specializing in gambling addiction. I saw her trying to rebuild her life, but it was as though the damage had already been done, and her attempts to change felt insufficient in the face of the enormity of her mistakes. One evening, as she sat across from me at the dinner table, her eyes searching for some sign of reassurance, I couldn't shake the feeling of disillusionment. "I've been trying, James," she said, her voice tinged with desperation. "I'm doing everything I can to fix this. I know it won't be easy, but I need you to see that I'm committed to changing." I looked at her, my heart heavy with conflict. It's not just about trying, Katharina. It's about the damage that's been done.
You've shattered my trust, and I can't just forget that because you're making some changes.
Her face fell, and I saw the pain in her eyes. I understand that, but I'm genuinely trying to make things right. I want to prove that I can change, that I can be the person you thought I was. But her words didn't seem to bridge the gap between us.
The sense of betrayal was too profound, and every attempt she made to rectify the situation felt like a bandage on a gaping wound.
The more she tried, the more I felt the divide growing between us.
The tension between us began to escalate.
Arguments became more frequent, often sparked by seemingly trivial matters but fueled by the deeper issue of trust and betrayal.
One night, as we argued over a miscommunication about her new job, the conversation took a sharp turn. "Why can't you see that I'm trying?"
Katharina snapped, her frustration evident. "I'm doing everything I can to make up for my mistakes. I'm working hard to find a new job, to fix my financial situation. What more do you want from me?" "I want to believe in your efforts," I replied, my voice tinged with frustration. "But every time you make a mistake or I see another sign of your past behavior, it just reminds me of how much trust has been broken. I can't shake this feeling of betrayal."
Katharina's eyes were filled with tears, and she took a deep breath before speaking. "I know I've made mistakes.
I'm not asking for immediate forgiveness, but I need you to at least acknowledge that I'm trying. I need you to see that I'm committed to changing."
The argument left us both exhausted and emotionally drained.
We retreated to our separate corners of the house, each lost in our thoughts.
The future seemed increasingly uncertain, and the strain of the conflict was taking a toll on both of us. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the sense of betrayal and concern for our future weighed heavily on me. The love I once had for Katharina was now clouded by the fear of repeating mistakes and the pain of broken trust.
Our future felt precarious, and every effort she made seemed to be overshadowed by the enormity of what had transpired. In our conflict, the question of whether we could overcome this and rebuild our relationship loomed large.
The emotional wounds were deep, and the path to healing seemed fraught with obstacles. As Katharina continued her efforts to change and rebuild, I was left grappling with the reality of our fractured relationship and the daunting task of finding a way forward amidst the pain and uncertainty. The reality of the situation had begun to settle in with a cold, harsh clarity.
Despite Katharina's earnest attempts to mend the rift between us, I found myself unable to move past the betrayal. Each time I tried to envision our future together, the weight of the past overshadowed any hope of reconciliation. The trust we once had seemed irreparably shattered, and I couldn't see a path forward that didn't lead to more pain. Every effort Katharina made to prove her commitment felt overshadowed by the enormity of what had happened.
Her attempts to rebuild her life, find new employment, and address her gambling issues seemed like a desperate scramble to fix something that felt beyond repair.
The more she tried, the clearer it became that the damage was too profound to mend.
One afternoon, after yet another emotionally charged discussion, I came to a painful realization.
I was simply not able to forgive her.
The betrayal was too deep, the trust too broken. The idea of continuing our relationship seemed impossible, and I felt a growing sense of despair as I faced the reality that we could no longer be together.
The decision to part ways was agonizing. I knew that staying together would only lead to more suffering for both of us. I began to search for a place to live on my own, hoping that some physical distance would help me find the emotional space I needed to heal.
As I looked for apartments and made plans to move, I felt a deep sense of loss and sadness, knowing that the life we had built together was coming to an end.
Katharina noticed the shift in my demeanor.
The conversations between us grew increasingly strained as I started making practical arrangements for our separation.
She pleaded with me, her voice trembling with a mix of hope and desperation. "James, please don't do this.
I know I've made mistakes, but I'm committed to changing. Can't we at least try to work through this? Give us another chance?"
Her pleas were heartfelt, but they no longer reached me.
I was overwhelmed by the emotional turmoil of our situation and couldn't ignore the reality of the trust that had been destroyed.
Katharina, I've thought long and hard about this. I appreciate your efforts, but I don't think I can ever move past what's happened. I don't see a way for us to continue together.
The process of separating was both emotionally and logistically challenging. We spent hours discussing the details of the breakup, dividing our belongings, and handling the practical aspects of our split. Each conversation felt like a final blow, driving home the reality that our relationship was over. In the final moments before I moved out, Katharina's eyes were filled with tears, and her voice was barely above a whisper.
I'm so sorry for everything, James.
I hope you can find happiness.
Even if it's not with me. I just wish things could have been different. I nodded, feeling a profound sense of sorrow and loss. I'm sorry too, Katharina. I wish things could have turned out differently. But we have to face the reality of our situation. I hope you find the help you need and can rebuild your life. As I left the home we had shared, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. The decision to part ways was the hardest one I had ever had to make, but it seemed like the only viable option given the circumstances. Moving forward without Katharina was daunting, but I knew it was necessary for my well-being. The end of our relationship marked a new chapter in both of our lives, one that would be shaped by the pain of our past and the hope for a better future. As I settled into my new place, I faced the challenge of rebuilding my life, finding my path, and coming to terms with the loss of the relationship that had once meant everything to me. As I packed the last of my belongings into the trunk of my car, I felt an overwhelming sense of finality. The familiar walls of our home, now empty and echoing with memories, seemed to mock the end of what had once been a promising future. Leaving Katharina behind was not just a physical departure but an emotional severing of a bond that had once defined my life. Driving away from the house, I couldn't help but reflect on the turbulent months that had led to this point. The weight of betrayal and the emotional scars from our failed relationship were heavy. But I knew that continuing to live in the past would only prolong my suffering. I needed to find a way to move forward, to carve out a new path for myself. The new apartment I had chosen was modest but offered a sense of independence and a fresh start. The first few days were filled with a mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and cautious optimism. I busied myself with unpacking and setting up my new space, trying to establish a routine that would help me heal and adjust to this new chapter of my life. As I settled into my new environment, I found solace in simple routines, morning jogs, cooking my meals, and exploring the local area. These small changes were a stark contrast to the emotional upheaval I had experienced, and they provided a sense of normalcy that was both comforting and healing. Meanwhile, Katharina was left to face the consequences of her actions. Her attempts to rebuild her life were daunting, marked by the financial and emotional fallout from her previous choices. I had heard from mutual friends that she was trying to seek professional help and had begun attending support groups for both gambling addiction and emotional recovery. It was clear that she was taking steps to address her issues, but the road to recovery would be long and challenging. Katharina's journey to start over was not without its difficulties. She faced financial struggles, strained relationships with friends and family, and the constant reminder of the betrayal she had inflicted. Yet, there was a determined resolve in her to make things right and move forward. Her efforts were genuine, and while I could not be a part of that process, I hoped that she would find a way to heal and rebuild her life. As weeks turned into months, I began to embrace my new life with a sense of cautious optimism. I started to reconnect with old friends, explore new hobbies, and focus on personal growth. The scars of the past remained, but they were no longer the defining features of my existence. I was learning to find joy and purpose in the present, rather than dwelling on what had been lost. Katharina's journey was a painful reminder of the complexity of human relationships and the difficulty of overcoming deep-seated issues. I wished her well from afar, hoping that she would find the strength and resilience to create a better future for herself. Our paths had diverged, but the experiences we shared had left an indelible mark on both of us. The end of our relationship marked a turning point.
A moment of profound change. As I looked forward to the future, I carried with me the lessons learned from our time together and the understanding that even in the face of deep betrayal, it was possible to find a new beginning. My journey was now one of self-discovery and healing, and as I embraced this new chapter, I hoped that both Katharina and I would find the peace and fulfillment we sought in our separate lives.